Is our Director of Financial and Emerging Markets and also our host of Net Zero Carbon here. So Danny, thank you for joining us. And I think that that's a really, really great segue into our discussion that we're having today, which is an important part of keeping things sustainable, is thinking about the broader impacts that the journey to sustainability has. So thank you for joining us, and I'm excited to get into what we're talking about today.
Likewise, thanks for having me.
So today's topic is kind of about how keeping electric vehicles truly green through battery recycling. And this is something that is really interesting because, as we know, when we're talking about using battery electric vehicles, batteries wear out quickly and they're not replaced very fast. And it can lead to a lot of unnecessary waste and a lot of unnecessary overproduction too. So let's talk a little bit about how that fits into the scope of sustainability and why we need these processes to get ourselves truly green and not just saying that we're green.
Yeah, I saw an interesting TED Talk recently where someone was just highlighting the emission impact of EV. And it was a really interesting illustration where he drew a box around the outside of an EV vehicle. And it's like, look, if we're looking at tailpipe emissions, we're not, we don't see any CO2 emissions, right? There's no CO2 emissions. But if we create that box a little bigger and we think about all the input goods that go into making batteries or mining materials for the batteries, then we start to see the true picture of the footprint of producing the vehicles. And I think that's what we think about, like when something comes off of the line, right? Internal combustion engine versus an EV vehicle, it's pretty commonly known that at this point, the EV vehicle has a larger footprint because there is such an intense process in mining and creating the batteries. And so, there was a recent article about Redwood Materials, which is a company that was started by a gentleman who was early, and really, I think, credited with starting the idea for Tesla. I believe he was sitting with Elon Musk having lunch and saying, what if we lined up all these batteries together and created electric vehicles? And Elon Musk, I think, says if that lunch would have never happened, then we wouldn't have had the Tesla. And so he saw, in building Tesla up, he saw one of the big problems was batteries and how inefficient it was to create those batteries. So the company that he started is specifically focused on taking and recycling batteries and creating a circular economy with the batteries so that we can lower the initial emission footprint of the EV vehicles. So we're not starting off from a place where we're worse than internal combustion. We're better than internal combustion. And then as we think about the lifetime of the emissions, how do we then lower the trajectory of the footprint, again, larger than just the tailpipe, but in the whole ecosystem? And so you think about, well, these vehicles are using electricity. What kind of electricity are we generating? If you look at the U.S. Generation grid, I think right now coal is still a larger percentage of our generation mix than renewables. So we need to shift that away, right? We've seen very strong push towards natural gas, replacing coal. We're seeing a large uptick in investment in renewable energy. And so when we think about, again, this larger picture around EV vehicles, it's reducing the battery footprint, it's reducing the energy footprint, and we do those things in tandem. And you start to see a really cool story where the starting point is lower, and the trajectory or the accumulated emissions over time is not increasing because we have such a strong presence of renewable energy. So these types of innovations are really important. And I think people should understand, as we look at these new technologies and they come to market, it's good for us to be critical of them and to find ways to improve. The thought is not to be dismissive of them. And I know that can be a challenge, right? There's a cultural shift. There's, a generational aspect of these things where older generations are probably less accepting of new technologies. Newer generations are quick to adopt. And I think when I see these conversations between these two groups and that are representative maybe of the overall sentiment across the United States or maybe even the globe, is that you have these tensions between the two arguments that create almost like a polarizing effect, right? People are pushing each other further away from coming to consensus. And so, hopefully these improvements and these investments really can galvanize people and bring people together so we can start to see the path forward.
And Danny, it's really early days, especially when we look at how far EV technology has come and how much further we want to take it. When we look at the recycling of these batteries, with new battery technology coming out, does that hinder the potential to recycle some of these current batteries being used, or are there still aspects that can still be recycled and still be used for current production and current innovation in battery technology?
Yeah, it's really interesting in this specific approach. The way that Redwood describes is that we're mining. We're not recycling, we're mining materials. And we're taking it a step further where we're actually creating the source materials here locally, domestically, that can then be used as inputs to these goods. So that's a very, different way of thinking about how these companies are approaching recycling. And it creates, to your question, right, it's creating the individual goods that then can be used in the appropriate manner for the different technologies as they scale. Obviously, lithium ion seems like it's the technology that is going to be carrying forward and being scaled at this point. So it feels like, at least from what I'm hearing, that there's starting to be some cohesion around the technology of the batteries. Now, obviously, the batteries are being done all different shapes and sizes and different applications. But if the raw materials are being sourced through this recycling process, that's hugely interesting. And what Red was saying is that the process is actually creating more refined materials. That the analogy was, imagine taking a glass of water and pouring it over and over again through a water filter. The more you run it through the process, the more refined the materials become. And they're claiming that that same process is happening here through the recycling that they're using, the technologies they're using to do this. And they're looking to get to scale, right? And they're announcing a bunch of really cool partnerships. They're, I think have 500 employees as of last year. So they're continuing to grow, and, they have a long history in EVs. So it's these things that we continue to talk about, right? And every week it seems like something new, some new technology is, it's there, but it's being bubbled to the surface, and exciting to see everyone pushing towards the same goal, but also doing it in a way that, allows for a lot of diversity of thought and technology. And I think collectively, all those efforts are really going to help continue to move us forward in the right direction.
Moving forward in the right direction also comes on kind of taking back our dependence on these initial input components for things like lithium ion from overseas production. One of our headlines today here, we talked about how China is this global dominant force in rare earth elements mining, and how the United States actually used to have a really huge share in it, but because of environmental regulations, EPA regulations, and really just kind of a distaste for strip mining and metals mining, we moved to outsource that to our products. And we see that because a lot of our lithium ion batteries, a lot of our battery technology comes from Japan, comes from Korea, comes from Taiwan, and we bring them trans-Pacific into the United States. Do you think that we need to find kind of this delicate balance between in-home production by using this rare earth mining technology, bringing it back here, and then combining that with the recycling technology of things that we already have? And is that a balance that you think can actually be found? Or do we still need to kind of have that reliance on overseas for materials at home for recycling?
Yeah, I mean, wherever it's most efficient, right, I think is the answer. The idea, one of the benefits of having a global realization that we're all connected here from an environmental perspective is, out of sight, out of mind doesn't really work from an environmental, like we're all polluting into the same atmosphere. And so I think finding the places that it's most efficient, and really doubling down on the recycling side of things. I mean, this has just kind of been an eye-opening experience in learning about what Redwood is doing, and how that, again, we talk about circularness, right? And there's certain technologies that are taking carbon out of the air and creating renewable fuels, and these early stage technologies, and the fact that this one is actually in production and producing quite a bit of power as it's measured from the batteries that they're producing every year, it seems like it's almost ready to scale, right? And so I remember when we talked to some investors, they're really focused on things that are happening now. They're also interested in emerging technologies that are around the corner as it relates to sustainability. But I think to have some of these things, and like Convoy, right? Like they're doing things now. They're reducing empty miles or looking at other technologies. And for the capital markets, that's where a lot of the focus is today is how do we invest in technologies that are already showing gains. And so we think of EV, we think of hydrogen, and we think of just really interesting operational efficiencies that are happening and investing in companies that are creating technologies that allow people to be more efficient. And so I think that's that's a focus for us is where are the investments? And then again, it's all about being efficient. So if it makes sense for us to have investments in renewable battery manufacturing and mining those to the extent that we have the materials, like that's an interesting thing for us to do if the efficiencies are there. But the interconnectedness, I think, is an overarching theme in understanding that we all just need to be working together to be as efficient as possible.
Danny, do you know if there are numerical estimates about, like, if we have this X many number of electric vehicles on the road, whether that's heavy duty trucks, medium duty trucks, passenger cars, et cetera, like say like between now and 2030, then we can expect this many batteries to be either out of production or be needed to be recycled by that date as well? Like, have those estimates been done yet?
For sure. I mean, I don't have the stats off the top of my head, but everyone's thinking about, a few weeks ago, I think we talked about the impact if you were to flip on a switch, right? And everything was EV today, the impact that would have on the grid, right? Like, we're just not ready yet to support those types of demands on the electricity system that we have. And also the generation mix may not be the right point at this time. And so EPA is always pushing out numbers and trying to educate, and so I think those are the questions that people are asking: is what are the impacts? How do we iterate through this? How do we sequence the events in the most beneficial way so that we can set up the industry for success, right? Like, I think one of the examples in the segment a second ago was from Glass-Steagall Anderson and Associates, where a corporate came out and said, we're going to be 100% EV on this specific lane. And then in assessing that commitment and that statement, they realized that wasn't a really efficient decision to make because they hadn't done the research to understand the availability of the charging, if it was the right type of trip to be doing, and also just the regulatory landscape around benefits or potential subsidies for that activity. And so in all, we need to be assessing, we need to be doing more of the measuring, more of the modeling to understand where the right places are to plug in, no pun intended. But that is, I think, the approach that's happening now. The initial wave of enthusiasm is now converting into a wave of research, and that's exactly what we need right now.
And Danny, this might be a bit ambitious or maybe an area that hasn't really been too expanded into. You talk to EV kind of entering spaces of industrial production or farm equipment and things like that, earth movers. I'm thinking about all these other diesel and gas-powered engines that are still motor vehicles, but just not quite within freight.
Great question. Yeah, that's, the profile of where EV makes sense is shorter distances, ability to recharge. So you think about for, let's say, like a farm equipment, right? For having the ability to stay local, to go out and to come back and recharge, those are the types of applications. And that's why you see a lot of it in the last mile vehicles, because they're making trips within a geography, within a city, and they can go back and they can recharge. The challenge, again, is obviously with the long haul. And so I think we've had a lot of interesting conversations about hydrogen, and there's been a big push behind hydrogen. And so everything's up for grabs. Every sector should be looked at. You think about what are the biggest wins, right? And so long haul trucking, because it's such an integral part, and you've seen this in the last 2 years, and so important in our day-to-day lives, that it is a big win if we can figure out how to apply sustainable approaches to transporting goods. That is such a big and important part of reducing our footprint. And it is often referred to as a hard to abate sector because it's so fragmented, because there's a large reliance on the systems. Even just recently, we were talking about hydrogen on Friday, not having the infrastructure today to support there's no hydrogen pipelines that network that's set up like the natural gas network. So we think about, again, how we approach it. What are the right ways to approach it? And I think the understanding the best applications and starting there first, and the market's doing that just right now.
All right, Danny, well, thank you for joining us for this discussion today. I think it's really interesting to see how it will continue to evolve, and we'll talk to you again soon. You can catch Net Zero on Friday afternoons.
Thank you.
All right, we're going to take another quick break. We'll be right back with our